we appreciate you all coming, and it's a lovely fall day today, isn't it? No, it's just perfect weather for this. I want to thank Eric and the Community Media Center for filming this. If you're not aware of it, they tape them every month. They run on Comcast Channel 19. And they also run on the Community Media Center's website on the video on demand. So if you ever miss one and you want to catch up, you can do it online or on Comcast. I also want to thank the Programs Committee. They've done a great job with the decorations and the desserts today. They work very hard on these programs, so thank you to them. And we'll just get started. We're actually going to do it in two parts today. The first part is actually going to tell you some ghost stories. So we'll turn all the lights out and get it really scary for you. And our speaker is Allison Kazaras. I keep saying her name wrong. Allison Kazaras. She is a professional ghost tour guide up in Gettysburg. And she has also been doing ghost tours here in Westminster through Birdie's Cafe. So she's got all kinds of good stories to tell us. So, Allie?
Hi. How are you? Okay, so what we talked about was ghost stories and legends of Westminster, because most people don't tour in their own backyard, right? I mean, most of you have been to the Historical Society maybe once, maybe. But the library does ghost tours regularly, and for Midnight Madness, Birdie sponsors them. So we only do them once a year down at Birdie's. So let's get started. I'm going to do the walk in the order that I would walk it, like a walk. Anyway, sorry. So we're going to start with Cocky's Tavern, and I'm only going to very briefly touch on that because the group after me has some very, very interesting stuff that they want to talk about afterwards, so I don't want to step on their toes too much. So a little bit of history. The building was built in the early 1800s. Nobody really has a specific date. And it alternated between being a private residence and a restaurant, an inn, or a tavern throughout history. But the few important parts that you should know is that Jeb Stuart, who is in charge of one of the divisions of Lee's cavalry, stayed there on the evening of June 29th before heading out to join the rest of his men in Union Mills on his way up to the Battle of Gettysburg. Somehow he got lost. We're not quite sure how. It's kind of a one road to Gettysburg. But he got lost. But that's not the point. Whole nother story. But he was there, which is kind of cool. And then much later in history, President Grant would have been there as well. But in terms of the ghost stories, while it was most recently a tavern, it opened up again in 1969. There were a lot of strange things that were going on, and the staff and the servers and all the kind of stuff would complain that they'd hear footsteps up and down the stairs and up in the floors above, and just where there wasn't anybody to be making those sounds. And they thought that maybe it was soldiers that, had never really left. However, none of the soldiers that stayed with Stuart died in the building, which is kind of odd. But the more you research this stuff, the more you find that you don't have to die in a place to remain in a place. It could be something as simple as having a wonderful, wonderful time in a surrounding, in otherwise surroundings of absolute trauma and terror, like most of these soldiers would have been involved in. So maybe it's just that was their relief, and they chose to stay behind on purpose. But the interesting stuff is there's a painting there, and we're not quite sure who this painting is of. We think it's a very bad painting of President Grant. And if you've seen it, it's a very bad painting of President Grant. Or it's not President Grant at all, which is what I'm hoping, that the artist wasn't quite so blind. But it's a very interesting painting. It's hung on the wall for forever, and they just keep pulling it out of storage whenever it changes hands, and nobody really knows where it came from or who the artist is. It just kind of comes with the building. And one afternoon, there were two ladies in there having lunch, and the one lady was filling her friend in about all the weird stuff that's gone on at Cocky's and the tales that the staff had told her, and this woman did not believe in any of this ghost crap, as she put it. And she went on to say that this is nonsense, and you're silly for believing in any of this stuff, and yada, yada, yada. And meanwhile, they're sitting under this particular terrible painting of Grant hanging on the wall. And as this woman is ranting on about how there's no such things as ghosts, and people who believe in them are silly and foolish, and on she went, the painting actually came off the wall and went on top of her head. And apparently she ran screaming from the building, I believe, I'm sorry, I believe. And they checked, and nothing was wrong with the painting or the wires behind it, or none of the nails had come out of the wall. It had just somebody in the house had said, "Hey, shh, we're here," in a rather abrupt fashion. Now, the other instance with that painting, it seems to be tied to a lot of people. But there's a regular who used to come in. His name was Mr. Walsh. Mr. Walsh was a lawyer. And every afternoon he'd come in for lunch. He'd sit in the same spot, also under that painting. Every single day he came in. He was a regular. They knew what he wanted when he walked through the door. It was almost out on the plate and ready for him by the time he sat down. And one day, Mr. Walsh didn't come in, which the staff thought was odd. And later that day, they found the painting on the table, just face down in his seat, and they thought, that's really odd. And come to find out the next day, Mr. Walsh had suffered a heart attack and had passed. What's really bizarre is that since that incident, the painting has started to look like it has begun to bleed from the wrists and the neck and, of course, the head. What it really is just the way the varnish on top of the painting has aged and has begun to run. But it's creepy because it's dark. It's like that dark reddish brown, that color of dried blood, and it runs down the face here, across the tops of the hands of the cuffs, and down across the front of his shirt as if the neck had been cut, which is just, and most people don't want anything to do with the painting at all, because, yuck. But yeah, so that's all I'm really going to say about Cocky's Tavern, other than this one little tidbit, which I find incredibly amusing. You guys may not, but I think it's funny. They get some stuff that happens throughout, as time goes by, and these guys will have the most recent stuff. But one of the gentlemen who works there, his sister had come in to visit, and she was upstairs in the second floor, and she'd gone to use the bathroom. And she finished doing her business and goes to wash her hands. And as she's standing at the sink, she got rather forcefully slapped in the rear. She got her butt just slapped. And she said she went forward and into the sink and then went screaming out of I don't know why she keeps coming back. Apparently the last time she was here, she had something else similar happen, and I would not set foot in the building. People are slapping rear ends. But yeah. All right, so the next one I want to talk about is the Shulman Fisher Sherman House. Say that 10 times fast. And it's not actually the house itself, more the old wellhead that sits behind it. It's called God's Well, and it's not really a ghost story, but it's a local legend and lore, and I kind of like it just because it's a nice story. And the story goes that a long time ago, and there isn't really a specific date attached to this, but a long time ago in Carroll County, there was a terrible, terrible drought. And in this drought, wells were drying up. And you guys are all local Carroll Countyans. You guys know how hard that is to do in Carroll County. It's very good water here. But the wells were drying up, and people were conserving their wells, and wells that had been originally shared with people who were passing by were shut off because people didn't know when their water was going to run out. You can't survive without water. So they started closing their wells off, and there were these two little old women who lived in what is now the Shulman Fisher Sherman House. And they said, you know what, we're not gonna close our well. We're gonna leave it open. And they're like, oh, okay. Well, you shouldn't, because you're gonna run out of water, and you really don't want to put yourself in this position. You're not working. You don't want to end up in trouble with nobody else to help you. And so they said, look, you know what? God provides this water for us, and if God decides that we're going to have water throughout this drought, then we shall have water. But it was pretty much a leap of faith, but our water is going to stay open. If anybody needs it, they can come for it, but we're not going to shut our well down. The drought would come and go, and these two women, their well never ran dry, not at all. It didn't even come close. So the drought came, lots of people's wells dried up, and it went, and then wells began to refill, but what is now known as God's Well continues to run. Now, the only reason it isn't open today, if you go there now, there's a big concrete slab across the top of it, and that's because, well, if you leave a wellhead open, people are going to climb into it, because they do. There's a terrible pun in there, and I'm going to try and keep it in my head, but something about wells and ways, and if there is one, you get it. Anyway, Yeah. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is our next door neighbor, the Westminster Inn. Do any of you remember when that was open? One of you? Just one? Two? There we go. Three. Yay. I hear it was an absolutely beautiful place. And a while back, it used to have a barber shop on the first floor of it. And there was a guy in there, the barber. His name was Jim Hopes. And Mr. Hopes was not only a barber, he fancied himself a Shakespearean actor. And so when he did his haircutting and barbering, he wouldn't always do it in the plain old white coat. He did it sometimes in Shakespearean outfits. I mean, full-on King Lear, Hamlet, you name it, he did it. And so his customers not only got a haircut and a shave, but also a show while they were at it. And he was a little odd, but, people liked him. It was a lot of fun. And one day, unfortunately, Mr. Hopes passed. And his wife would try to keep the business open as much as she could. However, she wasn't Jim. I mean, she could cut hair, she did a nice shave, but you went to Jim Hopes for the Jim Hopes experience, and she just couldn't hold the business any longer. And long after the business was closed, people used to walk past and look in the window and see the white barber's coat hanging in the corner. Or they'd walk past and see the silhouette of a man as if giving a big speech with scissors in hand. And they'd comment on it later. There's a weird guy over there talking to nobody in that room. And people would say, where? Oh, over under the old Westminster Inn. You know that building's closed, right? There's nobody in there. Afterwards, they go, oh, I'm not going there anymore. I'll find a different route. All right. Any questions thus far? Comments? Concerns? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness? No? Okay. Oh, yes, I see you.
Can we still see that painting anywhere you were talking about, or has it been disposed of?
No, the question was, can you still see the painting anywhere? Yes, they still have it at Cocky's. You go in and ask to see that really bad painting of Grant. They'll know exactly what you're talking about. Yep. Anything else? All right. Then the next stop on the tour would be the Old Opera House. It was built in 1854. It was commissioned by the International Order of Odd Fellows, so it became Odd Fellows Hall. And the important thing about the Opera House, because what is an opera house without an opera ghost, right? Those don't exist separately. And the opera ghost comes from late 1860s, about 1868. There was a gentleman, a comedian, or he fancied himself a comedian, out of Alabama. His name is Marshall Buell. And Mr. Buell's comedy act consisted of making fun of or poking fun of Yankee carpetbaggers. Now, that's a term that most people have no idea what it means. Yankee carpetbaggers, after the war was over and the South was in the middle of Reconstruction and trying to rebuild, they were a lot poorer off. They had a lot of troubles. There were some somewhat wealthy Yankees, people from the North, who would swoop into the South and buy stuff off of these people for pennies for what they were worth. And they were taking advantage of the people who were really down and out and in a lot of trouble, but didn't really have a choice because what are they going to do with this giant plantation house and all of this property that they can't work? And nobody's got any money, so nobody can buy it off of them. So they'd come in and they'd pretty much steal stuff from people, or that's how they felt that they were being stolen from. And so in the South, that act played lovely, right? And the first rule of comedy is timing. The second rule of comedy is know your audience. In Northern Maryland, after the war is over, that act did not play quite as well as he hoped. Now, this area was pretty split during the war. A lot of people, it depended on what area of Baltimore you rode through some days. There were stories of Union troops riding south through Baltimore, and they'd get flags and babies to be held up to be kissed and all that jazz on the north half, and then they got into the south half, and that's where they dropped into Confederate territory, and there were rocks being thrown at them. And so this state was very, very split. And so in some places, maybe it would have played well. However, that particular night, nobody was buying his act. And he's standing up there, and he's doing his thing, and he's pausing for laughter, and the crowd is silent. And he tries to continue on, but by the end of the first act, there have been some heckles and some jeers thrown from the back of the room, and he recognizes 4 guys who have been paid to follow him on his tour to heckle him. Somebody doesn't like his act, and they are going to ruin it no matter what they have to do. So they've got 4 guys who've been following him around, and they're insulting him and riling up the crowd as they're doing it. And so by the end of the first act, the crowd is starting to get unruly, and he goes backstage, and the stage manager's like, look, you can't go back out there. They're going to get nasty. And he says, no. The show must go on. I'm going out there. And he says, all right, but you should really it's better if you go now. But he decides, you know what? They don't scare me, so I'm going to go out there anyway. And second act rolls around, and at intermission, the crowd has armed themselves with rocks and lettuce and tomatoes, and I don't know if there's a cart that sells rotten lettuce and tomatoes, but they always seem to be on hand whenever a show starts to go wrong, so I think there's somebody at intermission with a cart. That's my own personal theory there. But the crowd has armed themselves with ammunition to throw at him, and 5 minutes into the second act, it gets rough. He is booed off a stage. He's booed, and he stays there and tries to continue on. There's a big rock that gets flung from the crowd. It lands right at his feet, which is unnerving and has started to make him very worried for his safety at this point. He tries to continue on. Another rock comes flying out, hits him in the chest, knocks him back, and at that point he flees from the stage and is backstage trying to figure out what he's going to do. The crowd is the sheriff's already been called. He's there and just getting people out and breaking up the mess. And Marshal Buell is backstage, and the sheriff comes out afterwards and says, look, you cannot leave now. Stay here. I've got a jail cell that I can lock you in, which for most people would be like, I'm not going in a jail cell. No. But this is a safe place. Nobody's going to come into the sheriff's office and mess with you. You'll be safe here. You can leave early in the morning when everybody's in bed sleeping off their drunks. And Buell says, no, I've got to be in Hagerstown tomorrow, which by car is what, an hour and 15, hour and a half, depending on how the weather is from here. Imagine doing that on horseback. That's half a day's ride. So he's got a long way to go, and he's got to be in Hagerstown tomorrow. Well, he can't waste time, sleeping off. I'll be fine. I'll wait until, the middle of the night, and then I'll go. Once the crowd's gone outside, I'll leave. And the stage manager's like, look, this is stupid. Take the sheriff's advice and do this. And Buell is going to be boneheaded and does what he pleases. And it will cost him. Because when he went to leave that night, those 4 guys who'd been following him from place to place were laying in wait for him out behind the building. And in the dark, he couldn't see them, because now, when it's dark, there's lights everywhere. Now, there's really no such thing as total darkness, but in town, behind that big old building, it's dark. He didn't see them until it was too late. He went to mount his horse, he was pulled to the ground, and his throat was slit from ear to ear. And he would die bleeding and alone in the parking space or the lot behind the Opera House. Now, when we talk about ghosts and ghost stories, we often think about present day experiencing stuff from a long time ago. And that's not always the way it works. And what happened, especially with Marshal Buell, he's a perfect example of this, was that people were seeing him the next day. And it started with the town drunk, and he said he saw him out behind the building. And people were like, blah, blah, blah. You're just drunk. Nobody believed that guy. And then he saw him again, and somebody else would see him. The stage manager would see him in the stairwell. Now, fortunately, they weren't seeing him as he passed with his throat opened, but they were seeing him, and he was just talking and gesturing and making motions like he was trying to finish the rest of his act. But he was doing it in different parts of and people saw him, and they described, what he was wearing, and they're like, he's dead. There's no way it's that guy. And so they saw him on stage. They see him in the audience. They see him, when it was the Opera House, or when it was Opera House printing, they had issues as well. And now the building is closed, unfortunately, so we don't have any modern stuff to come out of there. But tough crowds can be tough. But yeah, know your audience. Second rule of comedy. Don't ever forget it. All right. Let's see. The next stop on the tour, then, would be the old jailhouse the old county jail. And that jail was in service, actually, for quite a long time. But the story that comes out of that is about Big Tom. Big Tom was, as his name might suggest, very big. And Big Tom was a nice man, otherwise, until he started drinking. And then he got really just drunk and disorderly to a fault. And he'd get thrown in prison to sleep it off. And look, Tom, you cannot fight people when you're drunk. You've got to stop it. And one particular month, Tom had a bad month because he was arrested 4 times in 1 month for drunken disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace. And they decided, we can't help him here. This facility is not meant to hold violent criminals. So we're going to do the only thing we can do, which is send him off to Baltimore. And nobody wants to go to Baltimore for prison. Not now, not then. That hasn't changed. Nobody wants to go to Baltimore that much anymore. It's gotten scary. But anyway, no. So he's going to be shipped off to Baltimore. He finds this out, and he is terrified. I mean, he doesn't want to go there. He doesn't really belong there, and he does not want to go to Baltimore for prison. He doesn't belong with the murderers and all of the terrible criminals that are there. And the day comes that he's supposed to be transferred, and the guards come into his cell, banging on the bar, saying, "Hey, Tom," and they freeze because Tom has taken his own life. Now, there are 2 versions of this story, and I'm not quite sure which one I believe more. The first version of the story is that Tom had slit his own throat from ear to ear and had cut so deep and so hard that he had almost decapitated himself. So there's that. And then the other version of the story is that he hanged himself in his cell, and because he was so big, the weight of his body snapping against the rope actually pulled his head off. Both of which are horrible. But I think I believe the hanging one. I don't know. That's up to you guys. But either way, Tom would be relieved of his head. And there would be a phrenologist, which is a guy who studies the bumps on your head to help link them to your psychology and find out if you're a terrible person who's going to murder 18 people. Yeah? He wants to borrow Tom's head, wants to see what a violent criminal's head looks like or feels like, really. And so he gets Tom's head, takes it with him to his lab, and this head is alone. He's not supposed to keep the head. He's supposed to return it so that Tom can be buried with his head. But you guys can already see where this story is going. He doesn't give it back. He never gives it back. Tom's head goes missing. And poor Big Tom is buried headless, which is problematic. Now, there are a lot of cultures that really stress being buried as a whole. And that if you aren't buried that way, then your spirit won't be able to rest. And it exists throughout the world. And it's a really interesting theology. But anyway, it's interesting, though, because people say that after Tom was buried and laid to rest, sort of, people would see him still without his head, kind of reaching out and bumping into things, and stuff would get bumped and moved and shoved, and people would later come in. It was the Junction building for the longest time, and people come in and stuff would be, in wrong places. Like somebody had just run through and knocked into everything on the way out. And people tend not to break into government buildings just to bump stuff around. Just saying. But yeah, so people said that they've seen Big Tom reaching around trying to find his head. Wah. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about is the infamous Lee Masters. Lee Master is an interesting guy, to put it nicely. Master was, he was British. He showed up in this country a little before the Revolutionary War broke out, so he was here long time ago. And then the rumblings, and he came with his wife and his children. And rumblings of war were beginning to seep around, and people were talking about going to war with England. And Masters, and at this point, by the way, Masters has established himself here. He isn't really accepted because he speaks English, and most of the people here spoke German at the time. But he settles himself here. He's got about 60,000 acres of property out in what is now New Windsor, Furnace Hills, all of that area out there. He deals in iron. He makes iron. So he's got all those furnaces out there, needs all that property to chop down trees and feed those furnaces. But he's got a big chunk of land. He's pretty successful. He's settled. Well, if he picks a side during this whole little war thing that's about to happen, he doesn't want to pick the wrong side. Because if he goes with the British and they lose, he loses everything. And if he goes with the Americans and they lose, he'll lose maybe his life and everything else. So he decides the safest thing to do is to ship his wife and children back to England, and he is going to go hide out in the Bahamas. Nice. He waits till the war is over, waits a few years for everything to kind of settle down, and he comes back. Now, the people that he owned were kind of keeping the property running while he was gone. And it's really in bad shape, but he comes back and gets everything working, and it becomes more prosperous after the war than it was when he first started it. Now, his wife and children never came back from England. They didn't want anything more to do with him, which should give you a vague idea as to his character early on. And eventually, Masters decided, all right, well, I'm going to try and make myself a part of this community. I'm kind of lonely out here. He runs for mayor. He gets one vote. His. Poor guy. You feel bad for him. You won't for long. I promise. But anyway, so he decides, you know what the heck with you people. I don't care. I'm fine. I'm going to hide out here on my giant property. And he does for a while, but he gets lonely. And servants and slaves are one thing, but, you need a companion. And so he decides that he's going to find himself a wife. So every Sunday, he gets on his Sunday best, and he comes into Westminster, and he goes to church, hoping to find a lovely lady or a lady at the very least, she doesn't even have to be lovely at this point, to become his wife and help take care of him, maybe start a new family. He's not an old man yet. He's still got some life and vitality there. So he decides, all right, I'm going to try this. With no success. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. He was weird. He was that weird British guy. Because remember, everybody here speaks German for the most part. And he's odd. But also, he's cruel. And people know this. Reputations will follow because people talk. And the people who worked under him or the people he owned were talking about how he was cruel, and nobody wanted anything to do with him. And so eventually he finally would take his leave and say, you know what, fine, you can have your stupid lives over there. I'm going to stay here. And the only time he came into town was when he needed to for trade or for the railroad junction or what have you. And the stories that come out of Avondale, which is what his home was called, are horrifying. He decided he couldn't get himself a wife, so he'd find himself a concubine. And she was not a willing concubine, but concubine nonetheless. She was one of his slave girls. And her sweetheart found out about this and challenged Masters. Said, hey, no, she's mine. You're not allowed to do this. Masters put that down very quickly and made him watch as he threw his sweetheart, who was pregnant, by the way, with Masters' child, into the furnace. Told you wouldn't like him very much for long. And Sam, that was his name, went in shortly after. That's how Masters dealt with people who were uppity. Right into the furnace they went. And after they went into the furnace, it is as if they never existed. You did not speak of them. You did not mention them. You didn't think about them, lest you suffer the same fate. Now, eventually, Masters would pass. Thank God. And he would be buried at Avondale on his own property, which was pretty customary at the time. And his slaves, who were of their own old religions, would curse him, saying that his body would never be accepted by the earth, that the earth would constantly and forever push his body out. He'd never be allowed to be at rest. And it sounds just like a silly curse, right? Nobody believes in curses. But he was buried at Avondale, and a few months later, his coffin was pushed through the surface of the earth. He was 6 feet under when they buried him, too. So they reburied him, horrified, and after several months, the same thing would happen, which is just weird. Maybe there's gas pockets under there. I don't know what the actual natural explanation is, but I know that twice his body would be rejected on his own property. And so they would move him into town, and he's buried now behind the old stone church of the Ascension, right there on Court Street. And he's under a big stone slab now. He's in a vault under the ground. What's interesting, though, is that as time has passed, there's a tree right there. It's a real big tree, and real big trees tend to have real big roots. And I don't know if the tree was there at the time. Probably not. But regardless, there is a real big root now pushing his coffin up yet again. Yeah. And what's exceptionally creepy is that the slab on top of his grave is fractured in 3 places. Now, I have a feeling that has nothing to do with Masters being shoved up and hitting it. I think somebody broke it, and we're just going to blame it on Lee Masters. Yeah. Now, in terms of the ghost stories out there, and I forgot to mention this, in order to keep his slaves in line, Masters, and this is ridiculous, but he used to dress himself in a big white sheet, hop on top of his big black horse, and go tearing throughout the property, making horrible wails and moans and all kinds of other stuff, just to scare his slaves. He's a jerk. But yeah, so he would do all of that. Lovely man that he was. And the reason I bring that up is because people still say that out there at Furnace Hills or at Avondale, you can still see him out there riding his horse, big white shadow on a big white horse. And some people say that the eyes are burned coal red and that it breathes fire from its nostrils as it rides, which is corny, but awesome. And people also say that he's cursed to roam, and his soul takes the form of a big black dog with those coal red eyes that just peer out at you from the bushes or from the darkness. People say that they hear him out there howling and wailing, never really to be at rest for his horrible crimes against humanity. Now, recently, in terms of that house's history, the building was undergoing renovations. And they're looking at the blueprints, and they're looking at the house, and they're like, "There's a wall. What is this wall here? This doesn't belong." And so they rip down this wall in the kitchen that isn't supposed to be there. And behind it, in case you doubted me, behind it there is an old furnace, and inside there are ashes and charred human remains left behind. Now, it was a B&B for a little while. That stopped. And now it is somebody's private home. So please do not go out there and harass that poor woman. She's a very nice lady. But yeah. So that is the story of Lee Masters. Go visit him if you like. Just don't sit on his grave. That guy has creepy vibes. And other than that, the last very brief thing I want to talk about is Birdie's Cafe. Which is where we do those ghost tours right out of. That is a very old building there. And in terms of the paranormal, we're still kind of researching what's going on there and finding some new evidence here and there. But for the most part, the staff, myself included, we've had some interesting things happen. Most recently, stuff goes just tumbling off of counters when it shouldn't be. Lights get flipped on, and it's like, I didn't touch that switch. Why is the light on? And there's some other stuff, like you hear somebody on the stairs, up and down, there's nobody there. Now, there's people that live there now, so it's a little bit harder to distinguish real noises from paranormal noises. But when nobody lived upstairs, hearing footsteps up there, stomping around or running around, that was awesome at 6:30 in the morning. It's not creepy at all, especially when the sun's not up, right? But also there's that, we have one of those old theater chairs in there from the Carroll Arts Center when it was a theater. And we had it set one way because people were just sitting in it and left it that way. And a bunch of us are in the kitchen and we're all talking. And we hear this weird scraping sound from that center room there where the chair is. And we come out and we look because we're all like, what was that? So we come out and we look, and that chair has actually been rotated 180 degrees. It's facing the wall now. Nobody touched it. So yeah, there's that. And one of the girls who lives upstairs, she and her husband's up watching TV. She's asleep. And one of the cats that they have, stays in the bedroom unless she, needs to come out. But she's staying in the bedroom. And at one point, apparently, she needs to go out. So her husband is sitting in the living room and looks over across the kitchen to see the bedroom door open, the cat come out, and hear the bedroom, and looks and watches as the bedroom door then closes and clicks shut. And he says, honey, was that you? And then he turns the chair a little away from the kitchen and goes back to watching TV. Because the door doesn't, the next morning he tells her about it, and they are like opening and closing doors, trying to make the door open and shut like that, and somebody needed to let the cat out. So apparently the ghost did that for us. Thanks. He's really freaked out. He doesn't talk about it. But yeah. All right. Do you guys have any questions? Yes?
What was Bertie's cafe
before? It was empty for about 2 years, and before it was that, it was called the Pour House, P-O-U-R. It was the Pour House Cafe, and it was that for, God, forever. Way back? It was a residence at one point. It was a tailor's shop as well. It was shops for a little bit. There were 2 levels, and before that, I don't know. No, but nobody murdered there. No, not to our knowledge. There's bats in the attic, though. That's great. Yes? Where's the Opera House? It is located on Main Street. Let me see if I can think. Get my mental map here. As you come up past the library, you know where the old firehouse is? Where it used to be a Bell Atlantic building for the longest time? It's right before that. It's huge. And it's funny because it's an enormous building, and nobody knows where it is. But yeah, it's on Main Street. As you're coming from 27, it's on the right-hand side of the road. If you get to Center Street, you've gone too far. But it's past Longwell. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anything else? The Westminster Inn. It's the big building right next door. Big giant building right next door. Over there. It was going to be the YMCA for a while. That fell through. Now it's down on 32. But yeah, the Westminster Inn, big giant building right there on the corner of Center Street right there. Yes? What was that? Oh, Westminster, no, high school? Yes, West End. Okay, yes, I'm sorry. My info is wrong. I apologize. My bad. Anything else? Nothing? All right. Then I would like to thank you very much. It has been my pleasure to come out and speak with you guys this afternoon. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathy and, turn it over to Margaret here, and she will come up and speak about the investigation that they did.
Hello, I'm Margaret. I am the founder of Inspired Ghost Tracking. Julie here is one of my lead investigators. Can't say that we're going to be as impressive because our investigation at Cocky's did not get a lot of evidence, but we do have things from our medium. So we're going to explain a little bit about ourselves, go into the how we do investigations, and just all around give you a good presentation on it. Okay, I've always been interested in the paranormal. I was reading into a lot of the different ghostly stories and all as I was growing up. I lived in a haunted home that, as 12 years old, was very scary to me. And I saw things that most 12-year-olds don't see, like full-body apparitions. I did write a story about it. It is featured in Amelia Cotter's Maryland Ghost book. We have a copy of it up here for anyone that would like to read it, so I'm not going to really go into that too much. So it started me thinking, and I went and I asked a friend of mine that was part of another meetup group, and I asked her for help. I said, I want to start a paranormal group. What do you think? Would you help me? And we threw it back and forth for a couple of months, and she came to me and she says, what do you think of Inspired Ghost Tracking? Now, of course, if you look, the name of her group's Inspired Journeys. So she's given me her first name on it, and she says, with that, you can meet at our location. I said, okay, good, let's do it. As you can see, we started in October 2008. Our anniversary's coming up. It's October 27th, and we will be going and doing a really nice overnight investigation in Gettysburg. So that's how we celebrate, is going out on investigations. So I'd like to introduce you to Fred. Fred is one of our new members, and Fred doesn't know what he's doing. He saw ghost hunters, and he says, I'm in. I want to do it. So we put him in on some of our investigations. Then Fred started reviewing his evidence. And Fred would just get so excited about his evidence. He would send me a picture. He'd say, look, Margaret, I got an apparition. I'd say, no, Fred, that's a raincoat. And if you look, it does look like an apparition, but it's an actual raincoat. It was raining one of our investigations and stopped raining, so they hung it up. So then Fred, on the next investigation, he says, look, Margaret, I got an apparition. And I told him, you're closer, Fred, but that's actually a statue. So Fred's really, he's trying, and this is the way some of our members are. So back to the drawing board, and Fred goes and he sends me another picture, or all of his pictures, and he says, I don't think I got anything. And as I'm going back through his pictures, I wrote back, I said, hey, Fred, there's a woman in that window, and she wasn't with us. And if you look, there is a woman in this window. This is actually from a private investigation that we did. Actually, one of our members did not see it. She sent me all of her evidence. This is the garage behind their house. All the lights were out, the doors were locked, and this is one of the entry doors to the garage. After going through that investigation and sharing the information with the homeowners, the husband would not go back in the garage. So that's how some of our investigations go. You never know what you're going to get. And for us, it's Christmas. When we get that cool-looking picture or that cool EVP that tells you, get out, we love it. And it's like opening up that present on Christmas morning and finding it. So Fred, he was hooked, and he went to the big times, and he's now on Ghost Hunters with them. So that was my easy way of explaining it. Now, this is some of our evidence that we've gotten. This is at Dr. Mudd's house. And if you look, there's like a mist right here at the table. Of course, nobody's allowed to smoke in Dr. Mudd's house. There's also an orb up here in the corner. This is another one at Dr. Mudd's. You've got the orbs. There's a little bit of a mist here. We've gotten several things from Dr. Mudd's house. As a matter of fact, some of us are going to be on the TV show My Ghost Story for this season coming up. And we are going to be talking about Dr. Mudd's house. So any of you that watch My Ghost Story, it's on Discovery Channel. This one we got at Gettysburg, one of our favorite places to go. We're not sure what it exactly is, but it's quite big. And everybody has their opinion when it comes to the different evidence. This is another one at Gettysburg. Not sure what grabbed a hold of this girl, but I think it let her go because she doesn't act too, strange with it. This is one in Ramblewood, and if you look right in here, there's a man standing there. There's the eye, there's the nose, the mouth. Looks like he has a white shirt on, a little bow tie. And, of course, our bigger picture of the woman in the shed. This is again at Dr. Mudd's house. This is the one that got us onto My Ghost Story. If you look in the mirror, there's a man standing here. This man was not with us. Give you a little bit of a closer up. We zoomed in. He's full figure right there. And the guys that rent Dr. Mudd's house out, one of them is a Mudd, and he says that it does look like him. This one, which is really hard to see like this we had taken at a park up in Glen Burnie. And Julie had taken this picture. We were doing a releasement. A releasement is when we send them to the light. They cross over. And we don't just leave ghosts hanging when we do our investigations. If the client wants it gone, if we think it needs to be gone, like this place, a public place, we will do a clearing and we will send it over. This girl was, we believe she was killed at the park. She was stuck there for whatever reason, and we brought in a medium who did like a releasement. They released her and let her go. At the time that Julie took this picture, the medium was telling us that the girl was up there and she was standing there looking down at us and waving, bye. And Julie got this picture. And it's hard to see in this, but right in here is the face. You got the eyes, you got the nose, and you got the mouth with has a smile on it. And down in here, it looks like her hand. And if you saw it on the computer, it looks a little bit clearer. So any of you that wanted to come back up and see that is more than welcome. Our private investigations come from referrals. People that know that there have something going on in their home. We don't just come out to your home. God forbid, I don't want to walk into our home where a mass murderer is and he's just getting us in there to kill us all. Because unless you know how to talk to ghosts, we're not going to be able to come back and tell you what happened. But we have several questions that we ask. There's about 50 of them that I go over on the phone with the person. And they might go as far as, do you drink? Do you do drugs? What kind of medications are you on? These are things that are going to tell us, number one, you are an alcoholic and you're probably seeing things that you don't need to be seeing. Number 2, you might be a schizophrenic and just make things up, I mean, things happen like that, especially if you're not taking your meds. So when you tell me, no, I'm not taking meds, but yes, I'm a schizophrenic, then I'm going to think twice about going in. Then once we clear all the questions, we go in for a preliminary. Sometimes that's with the medium. And we take our medium in, and very few go in. And again, I sit down and interview you again. Because now we're face to face, and it's harder for you to tell me, oh no, I don't drink. Yeah, well, what's that empty fifth doing on your table? Did you drink it all before I got here, or what? So it helps us learn a little bit more before I take in a group of 6, 8, 10, and risk them being in a house that they have no business being in. So it is risky business, but we do have fun at what we do. One of our mediums is Rob Gutrow. Rob is also an author. He'd be a lovely speaker for y'all. He does a good job. His first book was Ghosts and Spirits, Insight of a Medium. His second one is Lessons Learned from a Medium. Lessons learned, you'll find us in it. All over the place. He helps us with a lot of our investigations. He went into Cockies with us. That is information that I'm going to share with you today because, again, it's only been 2 weeks, and unfortunately, sometimes it takes us up to 30 days to get all our evidence in. We all have full-time jobs. We have a life outside of the paranormal, so we take all of our free time that we can and work on the evidence. So what you're about to hear is all from Rob. Now, the overview, the shop at Cockies Tavern appears to be haunted by a number of intelligent entities. In addition, there are a lot of residual energies from museum artifacts. That means that the little baby dolls that are sitting in the museum, they have the energy on them. And that's where some of your hauntings is coming from. The report was written from the experiences of Rob Gutrow and Tom Williams, a developing medium. The report is separate by floors to make incident reporting easier. So on the first floor, Rob walked in the building. There was no indication that there was any supernatural present in the entry hallway. It was changed in the first room to the right, the gift shop. As soon as he stepped in over the threshold into the front room on the right side of the building, he got a headache. Rob always gets headaches when he's in presence of a ghost or a spirit. And he does tell you that there is a difference between ghosts and spirits. So he got his very well-known headache. He suddenly sensed a male ghost who was still working there. He was in his 30s or 40s and dressed in a dark suit jacket and pants. He wore a white apron around his waist. He had dark hair and a lengthy mustache and kept saying Merriman or Merry Man. Perhaps this was his last name or the type of client that went to the tavern. This was definitely a bartender when the building housed a tavern. Rob felt the male ghost squeeze his left shoulder. He told him that one that makes footsteps, he was the one that makes footsteps up on the stairway and on the upper levels. There's reports of someone walking up there. The footsteps were confirmed by Linda, who works at the shop now. In the middle room on the right side of the house, looking at it from the outside, Connected to the gift shop, both Tom and Rob got a very strong feeling that the bar was in the room. It was confirmed that the bar was in that room. There was a lot of residual energy in the room, likely from the emotional times that its patrons enjoyed there. I will like to tell you that when Rob goes into places, he goes in totally cold. He knows nothing about these places. He likes it that way. I like it that way because he confirms stuff that we know. This is the picture that Rob, he's an artist too. So this is the man that was in the room. He's got his mustache. He's got a bow tie on, a jacket, and that's what Rob felt. Front left side of the first floor museum room, there was a lot of energy in this museum room. The doll collection was emitting a deluge of energy. He kept hearing names associated with the dolls. He heard Miriam, Audrey, Mary. He sensed that one of these girls who lived in the house was disabled. His confirmation, he found out later that Mary was the daughter of one of the house owners, and she was disabled. The back corner of the room, Tom heard that a male ghost named Harry was there. As we looked around the room and checked out the paintings or photos using a flashlight, we came across a picture of a man named Harry Kimming. Tom confirmed it was him. We also had another medium that thought the same thing in the room with the disabled child. She said there was someone in there that she thought was disabled. So confirmation, Harry lived 3 doors down from Cocky's Tavern at 210 East Main Street. Harry was a postmaster who died in 1936. Rob theorizes that Harry dwells in his house and sensed that the ghost investigators were close by. So he walked through the walls of the 2 houses between to find us. Now we know that he's still living in this house. If anyone owns that house, we'd love to get in and try to find Harry. If you have a group or club in which you would like us to speak as a guest, just contact us at inspiredghost without the O at AOL.com. We also have cards up here which has our phone numbers and names and all that. Do you think your house is haunted? Come on, y'all. You live in Westminster. You gotta have something haunted. We dedicate ourselves to investigate, document, and provide help and intervention with paranormal, supernatural phenomena to clients in need. We operate out of Jessup and service surrounding communities. Our goal is to provide a free, confidential service that demonstrates professional integrity balanced by a combination of science and parapsychology. Our services, as stated earlier, we do the preliminary interview and research on the home. We do the investigation, and we follow it up by providing you with all results from our investigation. If you feel you need of our services, contact us, and we will come out to your home. Thanks, y'all.